This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Over the past couple of years, we have interviewed folks here on the Dover Download Podcast relative to the City Council and the School Board and their time being on either one. Now we're going to start a new series looking at the Planning Board. Today we have George Maglaras, who was on the Planning Board in the 1980s, and he has served the community in a lot of other forms and functions over the past 40 years, including that stint on the Planning Board. George, welcome.
No, thanks for having me.
If you could tell the listener who, for some reason, doesn't know who you are, a little bit about yourself and when you were on the Planning Board.
I'm a lifelong resident of Dover. I served now in public office here for almost 50 years. Spent the 1970s in the state legislature and chairing our community development program. And then I shifted when the community development program was winding down as a result of the urban renewal program, which took place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When that was winding down, I decided to move to the Planning Board, and that was in the early 1980s.
You were appointed, obviously, because it's an appointed board. Yep. What made you decide to go on that path? You just wanted to keep going, or?
Well, the experience I had through the community development program in the 70s, I noticed that there was a lot of things that we were doing in Dover that were not leveraging private investment. I guess you could define the 80s as a transitional decade. And we had come off the oil embargoes in the 1970s. Dover used to be, and when I certainly was growing up here, was the third largest industrial employer in our state. And during the late 70s and mid-70s and late 70s and into the early 80s, a lot of those manufacturing jobs disappeared. And our downtown was usually zoned back then. It was zoned for industrial uses because of the mills. So we had shoe shops and we had Eastern Air Devices, Claristad. We had these manufacturing outfits that were downtown, multiple shoe shops, actually. We had them on like Wise and Lawrence on 6th Street. We just had a bunch of them, and they were all closing down. So we had these old big buildings, especially the mills in the downtown. Most of them, believe it or not, had pigeons flying in and out of them. They were just abandoned industrial buildings. Like we see a lot of that today down through New Jersey. But during my time in the community development program, I recognized that we had to transition. We had to do something about, at least that's how I felt at the time, that we had to do something about the disrepair of our community and what we might be able to change the dynamic. Now, that's not easy to do because you had generations of leaders that worked under the old way where the downtown was our industrial base, and the newer generation was thinking, well, why don't we have industrial parks? And why, and it was cheaper to build, like for instance, Butler buildings, brand new Butler buildings that you could insulate and create assembly lines on, and that activity than you could in, like for instance, in an old mill.
Right. And at the time, the city owned the mill, if I remember.
The city owned the mill a couple of times during our history, mostly, and we operated actually the heating plant. Right. The city operated the heating plant to pay for the heat there, which when you think about it and you go back to it, it was like a sweetheart deal with the mill owners, simply so they could keep people employed. So we were coming off that generational attitude, and we had a lot of vacant and underutilized buildings in the urban core. I was just looking at it, and having grown up here, I just said, there's got to be a better way we can do this. So during the community development program, I learned that it was tough. We were doing infrastructure improvements in a lot of our older neighborhoods, which was a spinoff of urban renewal. So you go into some existing neighborhoods like North Pine Street and Durrell Street as an example, or Ham Street and New York Street. We went in and we looked at that and we wanted to do curb and sidewalk improvements. Everybody used to park their cars on their lawns and those types of things. So anyway, through that learning process that I went through, I decided the best place to move from when that program, the urban renewal programs were winding down, that I wanted to serve on the planning board to try to look at what we could do to change the focus and direction of the city. And that's why I call it a transitional decade, because we did so much during that time working with, I worked at the time with the planning director, Tim Sheldon, and I became chairman of the planning board within 6 or 8 months of my going on the planning board. to see what we could do about basically leveraging private investment. Now, back then, that was a kind of a taboo in town. There was a lot of old guard, for lack of a better term, that they had these old envies and jealousies that existed amongst people. And I always thought that people ought to have the right to invest in their future. And we just had a pile of underutilized buildings. And what was happening, if anybody tried to do anything, the way our old zoning ordinances work, you had to provide the parking for it. So what we were doing in Dover was tearing down every other building to provide parking. So we were tearing down all these historical buildings that we had in our urban core, as an example. We would just tear down every other building to create surface parking. I didn't like the fact that we were losing all these historical, beautiful buildings. Portsmouth stopped that practice really early on, and that's why Portsmouth has so many beautiful historic buildings in the downtown. If Dover had got started a little earlier, we may have had a different view of downtown that we have today. We tore down so much of our history just to create surface parking, which made, to me, absolutely no sense.
It's been explained to me by some planning staff from the time that it was a reactionary move, but it was also if we don't have the surface parking, we're going to die mentality, right or wrong. But that was sort of like the thought process that was occurring.
We used to have, believe it or not, we were fighting the creation of malls at the time. So when the Newington Mall came in the 1970s, we started losing all our retail base of our downtown. Now, I can remember when I was a kid, we would drive downtown. My father would drive downtown and park his car. And we had a lot more parking on the street downtown than we have today. And you park your car because then you'd walk home and then come back later on because you would go shopping on a Friday or a Saturday and you'd have something to eat in one of the restaurants and you'd go, clothing shopping or whatever incidentals you had to do. And that was all disappearing because the malls were the newest, greatest thing. The retail portion of our downtown was dying. So you've got empty buildings. The second and third floors of all these buildings were basically hugely underutilized, vacant storefronts. So it was a kind of a do-or-die situation. When somebody wanted to spend some money, they had to come up with a way to park. So they were tearing the buildings down beside them in order to do that.
Right.
And it was kind of when you look back on it now, it was kind of an act of desperation for any other way of looking at it. And you also had to have people who were actually willing to invest money in what many would consider a dying model, for lack of a better term.
Yep.
So in the 1980s, there was a group of us, we were considered progressives at the time. By definition, I guess they would call us progressive. But we saw a town that was in decline, a municipality that was in decline for a varying number of reasons. Just outside influences. They were just things that were taking place that were beyond the municipality's control. And so when you try to go through that transition, it's always hard politically to do that because some people don't want to change. They think it's okay the way it is. It's all right to tear down every other building and put a parking lot in. Interesting, I had a conversation in the early 1980s about why we were tearing down so much of our history. And a few of the leaders at the time, and I don't want to name them simply because I don't want to cast any bad feelings about them, but what they told me was interesting. They told me that those buildings represented poverty to them. Those people had grown up here. They lived in these, a lot of these apartment flats on the second, third floors of the buildings. Some of them didn't have running water. It just represented poverty to them. So they wanted to do the new urban renewal, quote unquote, way, where we have buildings that were constructed that are made of cement cinder blocks and glass fronts. That's that kind of dynamic that was happening in big cities that were successful.
Right.
So we need to do that here. So,
and it's interesting to think about, you mentioned it, that the leaders at the time had a mindset, and it's just as you grew up in a time period, and that sort of framed you, they would have grown up in a time frame that was probably more akin to the Great Depression.
Right.
And sort of a mindset of what they had to look forward to based on that Depression era thinking. So the poverty base probably is not a shock. It's a shock to us now.
Right. When you look back at
for them, it was just life.
Right. It was just it was an evolution for them. They thought it was progress for us to tear down the old the old buildings, and some of those buildings had tremendous architecture that you could never replace today. But I understood it once they explained it to me. I didn't like it, but I understood it. And they were a product of economy. You can wish for all kinds of fancy things, but if the economics behind it don't work,
right,
they don't work. And that was true during that period between the oil embargo and the high interest rates in the 1970s. Nobody was investing any money anywhere. The economy slowed. So then in the 80s, in the beginning of the 80s, we had the Reagan Revolution. And when the Reagan Revolution came along, people were looking at regulations as a deterrent to private investment, which I had agreed to. I agreed to that philosophy, at least as it related to leveraging private investment for people. So we were looking at all the zoning ordinances in the town, and I wanted to create a master plan program, and I worked with the city manager at the time, Bob Steele, and Tim Sheldon at the time but how can we change the way we're doing business here? And what's, politics is the art of the possible. I mean, what could we do, and what can we make happen, and what we can't happen, because it's just the nature of the beast. So that transitional decade was, looking back on it now, I'm glad we did what we did. It took a lot of political courage to do it. But as a quick example, we rezoned the entire downtown. We created we got rid of the industrial zoning of the downtown that existed at the time. We got rid of these draconian regulations that, as an example, back then, the way the zoning ordinances were written, you could never have another mill.
Right.
None of the downtown met the zoning ordinance regulations. You couldn't build anything in the downtown based on the regulations that we had at the time. It just didn't make any sense. So we went through a process with the planning board to change. Basically, the fundamentals of it was tried to take the existing old buildings and incentivize through the zoning ordinance the ability for the second and third and fourth floors to be readaptive use. And we talked about putting housing there, have people move into the downtown. It would help the commercial component on the first floor. So in terms of the urban core, the dynamics of what we built, the dynamics of the regulations we put in place would incentivize the readaptive use of the second, third, and fourth floors of the buildings for residential use, to try to have people live downtown, and then making a working, living environment where they would spend their disposable income downtown.
Right.
At the time, we had done a study, kind of a off-handed study, but it was a study. At the time, 79% of our disposable income was leaving the community.
Wow.
79%. Now, that's a lot of money. And I was one of them. I was guilty. I was going to Portsmouth 5 nights a week and spending my money in the restaurants in Portsmouth. We probably had 3 or 4 restaurants in downtown, had breakfast there, whether it would be Harvey or the Old Spartan or places of that nature. But other than that, at night, you didn't.
There was no opportunity.
No. I mean, outside the firehouse and maybe a Weeks restaurant up at the Weeks Traffic Circle, there wasn't a lot of restaurants. So everybody, especially the new baby boom generation that was coming of age, we all bolted to Portsmouth. So knowing that we were throwing all that money away and not reinvesting it in our own community, it really drove my thought process as chairman of the planning board through the 80s as to how do we capture some of that? How do we get some of that reinvestment back in the communities? I didn't do it on my own, of course. I had a lot of help, but members of the planning board, we looked at massive changes to the zoning ordinances in that community. I give you a classic example, multiple examples, like Sawyer Mills as an example. We have all those housing in Sawyer Mills. That was just a vacant building. When I was growing up, there was a grocery store there and like a Walmart. It was, that had gone by the wayside, and the building was sitting there vacant. So we got an EDA grant, an Economic Development Assistance grant, and we found some people that were interested in developing it, and I was 100% in favor of it, and it was industrial zoned. It didn't allow for the residential component, so I had changed the zoning ordinances and sponsored all the zoning ordinances changes for that. Did so with the downtown, the whole downtown. Then we looked at the Miracle Mile, and we reconstructed the entire Miracle Mile, and negotiated, myself and Bob Steele, with Shaw's and Shop and Save. I mean, Hannaford Brothers. It was a guy named Jack Thornton from Shaw's and Larry Plotkin from Hannaford. And it's interesting what happens is that, especially with grocery store chains, they're so competitive that wherever one goes,
right,
another is following it to figure out what market. They steal each other's marketing tools. And so what we did was I wanted them all. I mean, I just wanted them all. My dad, these people, older Dover residents remember the old Miracle Mile where we had Siegel City,
right,
which is, again, was a cinder block building with glass front.
Yep.
Right? A product of the 50s and 60s. That old urban renewal style building. We had the Giant store, which was way out in the back next to Dover Bowl. Mm-hmm. Dover Bowl moved from where it was on 3rd Street up to its present location where the casino is now. But we had Dan Star Market, and we had the First National store, in which my father was the grocery store manager there. But those things were all on the Miracle Mile. So we, when Shaw's came in and Hannaford was right on their heels, and so was a Market Basket.
Yeah.
So we were able to reconstruct the entire length of the Miracle Mile, tear down a lot of old stuff that was there,
and straighten it out because it was much more curved.
Right, it was curvy, and we also widened it. It was a 5-lane cross section.
Yep.
Not without some pain by some people that
Sure.
had run businesses there for a long time. A lot of them had to give up some land. It wasn't an easy drill. But we had a couple of major players that were interested in helping, to invest and change the face of Dover. So
what was the camaraderie or the tenor of the board itself like? Did people get along? Was there pushback? Were some of you moving forward and some of you wanting to hold the line?
In the beginning, in the early 1980s, but most of that old guard kind of disappeared, and we had a bunch of new folks that were appointed to the planning board that had a similar vision of mine, and they were all younger people. I say younger, they were probably in their 20s and some in their early 30s, but they had a business mindset, not so much covenant to the old way of doing business, and they were trying to do a new way of business. A lot of them wanted to preserve what we had. Now, you can think that just if you take, without that EDA grant with Sawyer Mills would have been torn down a long time ago. I don't know what would be there.
Right.
It was built right on the river. You wouldn't be able to build anything there because of the way this only.
It's a great example of an adaptive reuse that has flourished.
Yeah, absolutely. Same with the mills downtown.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we did some things that were very controversial, but when necessary. If you take the Silver Street neighborhoods, whether it's Belknap Street or Atkinson Street, Cushing Street, Lexington Street, all these old, beautiful homes, big old, beautiful homes. Well, in the 1970s, during the oil embargo, nobody could afford to heat them.
Right.
And a lot of them, more than almost 2/3 of them had fell into disrepair, especially once the oil embargo hit in 73 through the 1970s and early 1980s. These buildings were People, first of all, they were paying for the heat. They couldn't afford to heat them. So they were falling into disrepair. So we had looked at that whole neighborhood in that whole area. We went up to Summer Street, Spring Street, and all those neighborhoods were these old, beautiful homes, but they were in really tough shape and had maintenance for a long time. Some did, but not a lot.
Yeah, majority were decrepit.
Yeah. So we were trying to say, okay, so what are we going to do with this? Are you going to tear them down, or do you create some incentive for some kind of rebirth for those? So we looked at that, and I wanted to create a zoning ordinance that leveraged private investment and to, for lack of a better term, carve the buildings up into as many units as they could get, many housing units, because at the time we had, as most people don't realize, more than probably at least half of our housing units in Dover are rentals. And back then it was driven by the university.
Right.
And because I was young, I had the tendency to want to help younger people find places to live and to stay here. So what we did was we changed the zone.
I was going to say, if we didn't have people living here, we wouldn't have vibrancy.
Right. And so I guess through this transitional decade, I was interested in creating as much diversity as possible. That was a tough job, though. It was tough to get those zoning ordinances changed in those old neighborhoods. There was still a lot of old Dover families that lived there that didn't want those changes in the neighborhood, and I understood that. I also understood that folks that had a lot of money, now I was growing up, we had a nickname for it, was called the Gold Coast. At Silver Street, my father always told me, if you ever become anything in this town, you'll live on Silver Street or one of these neighborhoods up here. You won't live on Cochico Street or by the railroad tracks or by the waterfront. You're not going to live there. You're going to live over there. And what was happening was there was a shift of attitudes towards the river.
Yep.
towards all of our rivers, the Piscataqua River, the Bellamy River, the Cocheco River, the Salmon Falls River. So all the people with any wealth started to move to the river, and they wanted to live on the river. The river was cleaning up, and so we had a shift where that we didn't have the people that had some capacity living on Silver Street anymore, or any of those places. They shifted. So
it strikes me that your perspective is grounded in the fact you grew up here and your family has been in this community for a long, long time. So you have that background and you can relate to those folks. But at the same time, you're forward thinking. So you say, how do we keep my generation, meaning yours, and my generation, meaning mine, here? And how do you keep people saying, it's not dirty Dover, but here's the future of the community? And so you really have straddled that boundary through your whole career, not just on the planning board, but a lot of what we've talked about has sort of revealed that transition of how do we have one foot in the past and one foot in the future.
Right.
You've also mentioned a lot the planning staff and the city manager. Where was the council in these conversations?
Oh, well, the council, by the late 1980s, I don't want to say that they had it with me, but they have.
I thought they invited you into the club and you became the mayor.
Yeah, I did become the mayor, but what happened was in the 80s, we had made so many changes to our zoning ordinances. We got rid of agricultural zones. We made them accessory uses. We created the R40 zone, which allowed for more single-family homes in the outskirts of the town. I mean, we just did a lot of stuff. That, and there's an old saying in politics, for a reaction, there's an equal opposite reaction. Well, the reaction was building. They thought there was a political atmosphere that we were growing too fast. That we were growing too fast, that the rules that we were putting in place, so the council would hear these complaints by neighborhoods. This is changing. We don't like it. You have to stop this. It's too much at once. But during the Reagan Revolution and that time, the country felt good about itself. It's just the facts. Right? The majority of the people thought the country was moving in the right direction. Reagan made everybody feel good about America. And so you had these younger people, even though I was a member of the Democratic Party, I was a Reagan Democrat, for lack of a better term. We were all excited about this investment because we're trying to invest in our own futures. And I was, like many people, I saw so many people that were my age leaving Dover because there was no opportunities here. So looking back at it all now, there was probably a few things I would have changed, but not much, because I think that sometimes it takes decades and decades for these things to come about.
Right. You got to seed it and you got to water it and you got to.
Yeah. And you got to pay attention to it. And economies play a major role in that, like what we're going through with the waterfront right now. I mean, I can remember back then that 98% of the urban core of the city was developed. And of the 98%, the 2% that remained in the 98, 85% of that was in the waterfront. So, it's taken the community a long time. We had to move public works. We had to move the wastewater treatment plant, which the first step was to move the wastewater treatment plant. It never should have been put there anyway. It was a poor decision that was made by our forefathers. It was the wrong decision and never should have went there.
I'm going to guess it was the cheap decision.
It was. If I told you how the deal came down, you wouldn't believe it. But I might as well tell you because all these people are dead. Actually, the waterfront was one of the areas that they looked at when we first had urban renewal, because the Main Street area of town was blighted. I used to deliver newspapers to all these bar rooms. Everybody worked in the mills, and depending on the nature of your upbringing or your nationality, every nationality had its own bar.
Gotcha.
So we had Irish bars, we had Greek bars, we had the Lebanese. Everybody had their own bars. The French, they all had their own bars. So when the mills would get out, right, they'd bring the bell, shift, and boom, and everybody would run to their bars. I mean, I used to deliver newspapers to all those bars when I was a kid. So I knew a lot of those folks, knew them all by first name. And in any event, it's taken, 50 years now to get the waterfront moving. It's moving at a good pace now. It is. The part I wanted to mention was that how the treatment plant got there. How the treatment plant got put there was that the actual place for the treatment plant, the right place for the treatment plant would have been Dover Point. But of course, back then, Dover Point was made up of a lot of rich folks.
It was the new Gold Coast.
Yeah, it was the new Gold Coast, and they didn't want the treatment plant down there. And so at the time, a deal was struck by the city council. We had a town where Maglaras Park is now. That was the town dump. And my Uncle John was on the council and city council in the 50s. And they wanted to build this wastewater treatment plant to try to clean the river up. My family, my dad and my uncles wanted to get the river cleaned up because it was bad. Matter of fact, Cornell University did a study of the Cocheco River in the 1960s and said it was one of the top 10 most polluted rivers in the United States. To give you some idea what was going on in the river. Okay, but anyway, the bottom line is that there was a deal cut. If we get rid of the dump, take the dump out of our backyard,
Right.
and we'll take the treatment plant. Because nobody wanted the treatment plant.
Right.
And so they discussed with Harry Tolan about taking over his farm on the outskirts of town, and that's how we ended up with the Tolan Road landfill. They made a deal with Harry Tolan to buy his farm, and the rest is history. We're there. So
you refocus you reposition the waterfront, as it were.
Yeah, pretty much. And then all the sewerage was, and as a result of all that decision, put the treatment plant there, it created the fact, the city developed in a very different way as a result of that. We have so many pump stations, you get sewer pump stations everywhere. And had you ever located it where it is now today, or at least further down Dover Point, you could have gravity fed.
It's interesting you say that because we're actually looking at discontinuing a few of them and creating gravity lines to Varney Brook.
To Varney Brook, right.
Which serves essentially the same purpose as a pre-treatment flowage to get.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
So as we wind down the conversation, at some point you say, I'm done on the planning board. I need a new challenge. I need to do something different.
Right.
I'll end up being the city council.
Yeah, I ran for mayor. I left the planning board in 87.
Okay.
I got elected to the Board of County Commissioners. Got elected as chairman of the Board of County Commissioners in January of 87. So I decided that I would focus my attention at the county. Still wanted to serve on, I got appointed to the Industrial Development Authority.
Okay.
The old Industrial Development Authority, which doesn't exist anymore. And then I ran for mayor 2 years later in 89. Well, I ran for council and then got elected.
So it was a evolutionary move. You wanted to get to the county level and be at a different perspective, as opposed to you'd done your time and you were done.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah.
Would you encourage someone to get on the planning board if they were listening to this and they were looking for ways to get involved?
Absolutely. I mean, the planning board, if it leverages itself correctly, and I don't mean that in a bad way, it's probably the most powerful board in the city. It really can make a difference with regulation as to what happens. Because at the end of the day, especially nowadays, everything is based on economy and economics. Years ago, some folks would say, well, I'm okay the way it is. I can remember when I was going up through those old neighborhoods and trying to put in infrastructure. When I was acting planning director for a year. We didn't have a planning director for a whole year. We just had a secretary and a part-time building inspector. I mean, that's what we had. But I'd go up there and try to convince these folks that this would be the right thing to do. And we had federal money to do it. And the minute I told them we had federal money, everybody would say, we don't want anything to do with the feds. They don't want anything to do with the feds, Leave us alone. We're fine the way we are. Everything was right. Even though we had raw sewage running out their backyards, and running into streams, that was all okay. Everything's fine. Just leave us alone, leave us alone. And I understood that to a certain extent. But I probably would have liked to seen the change quicker simply because I didn't like the pollution and the
no one wins in that scenario.
No. But I would encourage anybody, because I think that if you're on the planning board and you're a strong leader and you have a vision for where you want to take us, I think that's great. And every once in a while, a good revolution's a healthy thing. Every once in a while, and looking at Dover today, there's been a lot of effort made in the last 10 years to change. Kind of growing off of what we tried to do in the 80s, at least from my perspective. I always dreamed about having 4- and 5-story, 10-story skyscrapers in downtown Dover. I never thought I'd ever see it, but I always thought that would be quite a cool thing for Dover. And we're not quite there yet, but we're pretty close. Yeah.
We certainly have some 5 and 6.
5- and 6-story buildings, and having people live here and spending their money here, which is what the focus was for us in the 80s. Try to change that whole attitude of dirty Dover, and to change it around. I can remember going to Bill Clinton's first inaugural ball and running into a woman from Cambridge, Massachusetts at the ball. She was actually sitting friends with Loretta Swit, who was from MASH, and I was a mayor at the time, and there were no stools at this ball. There were just standing tables. There was no place for you to sit.
Craig Benson organized it?
Yeah, really, pretty much. So anyway, the bottom line was I went up to the stage and saw Loretta Swit standing there with this elderly woman. And I said, "Are you part of the entertainment tonight?" I didn't know because it was Loretta. She goes, "I'm not part of the entertainment." She goes, "I'm an invited guest." I said, "Well, son of a gun, so am I." Right? That's what I said, right? And so she says, the woman from Cambridge says, "Could you find me a stool?" I go, "Well, it's obvious there aren't any chairs here." So I went up on stage and there was an orchestra band set up there. And I took the tuba player's stool and I brought it down. I said, "Here you go." And I said, "But when the band starts, the tuba player's probably going to want the stool back." So she says, "You have a funny accent." Loretta Swit said it to me. "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from New Hampshire. I'm from a city up there called Dover." And this elderly woman from Cambridge said to me, she said to Loretta Swit, she turned to her and she goes, "Oh, Loretta, I've been to Dover, New Hampshire. It's such a dirty little town." And that always stuck with me.
Yeah.
For her, and this is a woman from Cambridge telling me that, saying that to Loretta Swit. So I looked at her, I said, "Well, Dover for a long time was considered that way." I said, "But it's changed a lot, and it's going to change a lot in the future." So the woman just stared at me, because she was totally disgusted that I was from Dover, New Hampshire, and I was at Clinton's inaugural ball. So that gives you some idea of how far out.
Absolutely. That's what I was just going to say is the time frame and the changes since then.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being the inaugural conversation here on talking to planning board members here on the podcast. We are going to follow up with Ron Cole from the 1990s and then John Schwarzenegger from the 2000s and Kurt Schumann from the 2010s. All of you are going to have conversations that I think build on the foundation that you created.
Yeah.
And I suspect we'll hear more about reflections on the past from the other folks, but I'm glad you set the stage with us on this foundation.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks a lot. It's good to think about all the changes that have been made. A lot of them, 90% of them for the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
You just heard from former Mayor George Maglaras about his time on the planning board in the 1980s and some of the initiatives from that era that helped plot a new future for the city. George has been involved in civic life and politics for much of his life, including as chair of the Stratford County Commissioners, a position he still holds today. It's probably no accident that George has been on that trajectory, given his family's own political history, whether that be his mother, Estelle, who served on the city council, his uncle John, who also served on the city council and as mayor, as well as a state legislator, and siblings who have been involved with other Dover boards and commissions. That legacy would also include his uncle Arthur, who, this week in 1987, passed away at the age of 61. Arthur D. Maglaras was noted as more than just another politician. As former city councilor and mayor Geraldine Sylvester noted, quote, "He was one of the best councilmen as far as working with his people. He would see that when his constituents had problems, they were addressed and resolved." Born on December 29, 1925, Arthur was a lifelong Dover resident who dedicated himself to serving the citizens of his city. His political career included 6 years on the Dover City Council and 8 years as a state representative. During his time in the legislature, he served on the Ways and Means Committee and the Planning Committee, where he focused on keeping government responsive to people's needs. Perhaps what many Dover residents remember most about Arthur Maglaras was his barbershop. Following in his father's footsteps, Arthur began working at Dan & Sons Barbershop in downtown Dover when he was just 12 years old. The shop eventually became his own, Maglaras Barbers. The barbershop became a community institution, described in Foster's Daily Democrat as, quote, "a staple of Dover government and nearly as important as City Hall itself." It was where locals gathered daily to chew the political fat and plot strategies. One of Maglaras' causes was his opposition to separating Wentworth Douglas Hospital from the city of Dover. In 1981, he fought vigorously against proposals to change the hospital's status from quasi-municipal to a non-profit community hospital. Maglaras said, quote, "It would be the greatest robbery since King Tut's tomb." Maglaras believed the city would be giving away its title to the land. He was concerned about hospital accountability and feared expansion without regard to cost. He said, quote, "We're a mill town. We can't afford that kind of expansion." Despite his efforts, the hospital did split from the city the following year in 1982, a change that Maglaras viewed as violating the spirit of trusts given to the people of Dover via the hospital. Arthur Maglaras wasn't afraid to propose controversial legislation when he believed it served the public good. In 1987, shortly before his death, he introduced a bill prohibiting hunting deer with rifles in Dover. As a lifelong hunter himself, Maglaras sponsored the bill after receiving complaint from constituents concerned for their safety. He cited instances where bullets had been, quote, shot right through houses, and argued that high-powered rifles were unsuitable for an increasingly congested Dover. The proposal was met with opposition from local sportsmen, who argued that Dover residents should have had the opportunity to debate the issue locally before it was brought to the state level. Nevertheless, Maglaras persisted in this effort to improve safety in residential areas. Arthur Maglaras died on April 12, 1987, at the Pease Air Force Base Hospital after a long illness. He left behind a legacy of tireless public service and a reputation for putting his constituents first. As one tribute put it, quote, "Few in the city could match his commitment, sincerity, compassion, and influence. He cared deeply about the city and its people." In an era of Dover's growth and change, Maglaras worked to, quote, temper that change by keeping government responsive to people's needs. While accepting Dover's changing landscape, he, quote, wanted to keep its small-town feel. In his own way, he did.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.